At Sunday dinner, with the smell of roasted chicken still in the air and the clinking of forks against porcelain echoing in the background, I never expected the sharpest cut to come from a child's mouth. My niece sat there, her eyes darting between me and the bracelet on my wrist, before she rolled her eyes with exaggerated disdain. Then, as if rehearsed, she smirked and delivered a line I will never forget. "Mom says you're too poor for real jewelry." Time froze. The room grew quieter than the clatter of silverware could ever make it. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, some curious, some pitying, and others filled with that silent judgment only family can deliver so well. It wasn't just a childish remark. It was a dagger disguised as innocence, sharpened by her mother's whispers. And in that single instant, I realized the years of subtle digs, backhanded compliments, and quiet exclusions had finally reached a boiling point. I smiled faintly, though inside a storm brewed, one that would make this Sunday dinner unforgettable for everyone at that table. I looked at my niece, and instead of snapping back, I forced myself to swallow the words burning on my tongue, because I knew exactly where they came from. Her mother, my sister-in-law Diana, had always found a way to undermine me, quietly, slyly, as if her mission in life was to make me feel small. She had the house with the vaulted ceilings, the kitchen remodel straight out of a magazine, the constant stream of new handbags she paraded like trophies. And me? I had chosen a simpler life, one that didn't revolve around drowning in credit card debt for the sake of appearances, one where I worked hard, paid my bills, and made choices that kept me secure even if they weren't flashy. But Diana hated that. She wanted me to play her game, to compete with her in the arena of image. And when I refused, she twisted it into weakness. The truth was, my jewelry had meaning. The bracelet my niece mocked wasn't bought in some glittering mall store with a payment plan Diana couldn't afford. It was a gift from my late grandmother, who had worn it every Sunday until the day she died. That bracelet had history, value far beyond money, but of course Diana saw none of that. And now she had poisoned her daughter into carrying her cruelty for her, delivering the blow while she sat back and smiled sweetly across the table, as though butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. I felt my stomach churn, not from embarrassment, but from the sheer audacity of it all. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I remembered every time Diana had made a remark about my clothes, every pointed question about whether I'd ever think of moving somewhere nicer, every false laugh she gave when I spoke about my work. She wanted me humiliated. She wanted me to shrink. But what she didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that I had been quietly building something she couldn't touch. Something that had nothing to do with handbags or diamonds, but everything to do with security and power. And as my niece's words lingered in the air like smoke, I realized Sunday dinner wasn't going to end the way Diana expected. Not this time. I glanced down the table, watching Diana sip her wine as though nothing had happened, her eyes carefully avoiding mine, which told me everything I needed to know. She had planted the line, waiting to see how I would squirm when her daughter delivered it. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't about to give her the performance she craved. I leaned back in my chair, steadying my breath, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make the others uncomfortable. My brother shifted, my father coughed, and finally Diana raised her glass with a smug little smile, the picture of innocence. But beneath it all, I saw the challenge. She thought she was untouchable because for years she had ruled these dinners with her sharp tongue wrapped in sugar, her little digs dismissed as jokes, her superiority disguised as charm. I thought back to the last holiday when she asked me loudly in front of everyone if I'd considered selling my car for something safer, as if my modest sedan was a death trap compared to her luxury SUV, or the birthday party when she joked about how I must love thrift shops while wearing a dress she had bought on credit that she was still secretly paying off in monthly installments. I had stayed quiet then, thinking I was preserving peace, but peace built on silence is just another form of surrender. As I looked at my niece, who sat there wide-eyed, realizing she might have gone too far but too scared to back down, I felt an ache of sadness. Children shouldn't carry their parents' bitterness, but Diana had made sure hers did. And yet, the sadness only fueled the fire already burning inside me, because Diana wasn't going to stop. She was going to keep using me as her family's cautionary tale, the example of what not to be, all while her own castle was built on sand. She didn't know what I knew. She didn't know that for the past 2 years, I had been quietly working with lawyers, with accountants, putting things in place that would shift the balance of power she thought she owned. So while she smirked into her glass, I smiled too. Not out of embarrassment, but because Sunday dinner had just become the perfect stage. And very soon, Diana would find out that the woman she had dismissed as too poor for real jewelry was the one holding the real wealth, the real power, and the keys to a future Diana couldn't buy her way into. I picked up my fork and let it scrape lightly against the plate, the sound sharp enough to draw every eye back to me, and I could feel the tension hum through the table like a current. My niece looked away, cheeks flushed, realizing too late that her words had struck deeper than she understood. Diana, on the other hand, looked almost triumphant, her chin tilted high as if she'd already won some invisible battle. But she didn't see the truth, that I wasn't rattled, not anymore. I thought about the nights I had spent alone at my kitchen table, poring over bank statements and legal paperwork, making sure every cent I invested was safe and accounted for. While Diana and her husband threw parties they couldn't afford, financed cars they didn't own outright, and pretended their credit cards were endless wells, I had been disciplined, steady. I had bought shares in my company when no one believed it would grow. I had reinvested when others cashed out. And quietly, without fanfare, I had built something lasting. I remembered the moment my financial advisor told me I had enough to retire comfortably if I wanted, that I had positioned myself better than most of my peers. I hadn't celebrated with champagne or a designer bag. I had sat quietly in my small living room, smiling to myself, knowing the peace of never having to beg or borrow. And now here I was, being called poor by a child repeating her mother's venom. The irony made me want to laugh. But instead, I lifted my eyes slowly and met Diana's gaze across the table. I held it long enough for her to shift uncomfortably, her confidence faltering under the weight of my silence. I didn't need to correct my niece. Not yet. I didn't need to justify the bracelet or explain its history. I knew the truth. And soon, so would everyone else. Because this dinner, this table where Diana had reigned for so long, was about to become the stage where her empire of image crumbled. Not with shouting, not with insults, but with undeniable, irrefutable proof that the woman she mocked had already surpassed her in every way that mattered. And the best part, I wouldn't even have to raise my voice to do it. I could feel my brother's eyes on me, heavy with that mixture of discomfort and silent pleading, the way he always looked whenever his wife sharpened her claws at me. He wanted me to let it go, to play the role I always did, the quiet sister, the one who kept peace at the table while Diana strutted on her little stage. But I was done being the buffer. I glanced at him briefly, long enough to let him know I saw his silence, then turned my attention back to the table. My father tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, asking my niece about school, but she mumbled an answer and pushed her peas around the plate, clearly sensing the shift in the air. The truth is, Diana had used these dinners for years as her platform. Every roast, every casserole, every clinking glass of wine was her backdrop for humiliating me in front of the family, and I had swallowed it, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. But that night, as I looked at the smug curve of her mouth, I thought about the folder sitting in my bag by the door, the folder I had debated bringing, the one with the paperwork her husband had signed without fully reading, the one that tied certain investments directly back to me. Diana thought she had the monopoly on appearances, but she didn't know the ground she walked on was shifting beneath her feet. Her husband had approached me 2 years ago, desperate for capital for a project he was too proud to admit wasn't fully funded. I had helped, not for him, not even for her, but because it was a sound business opportunity. What he hadn't realized was that the terms had been clear. My return would come in shares, not just repayment. And now, quietly, steadily, I owned more of that company than Diana's husband himself. I sat there listening to the small talk bubble and fade, and all I could think was how sweet it would be to finally let the truth slip out. Not in anger, not in defense, but as a simple fact no one at that table could ignore. Diana thought her words had power, but soon she would learn that mine had teeth. I let the chatter swirl around me for a few minutes, listening to the clinking of glasses and the forced laughter that tried to patch over the tension Diana had created. My niece fidgeted, no longer so smug, while Diana pretended to be engrossed in a story my father was telling, though her eyes kept flicking toward me like she was waiting for me to crack. But I wasn't going to crack. I was remembering too much. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every family gathering where Diana had turned me into the punchline. I remembered the Christmas she gave me a gift in front of everyone, a fake designer wallet she'd picked up at a discount store, wrapped in glittering paper, knowing full well she'd later brag about the real one she bought herself. I remembered the Easter she leaned over the table and asked, in front of my mother, if I had ever thought about freezing my eggs since no man would want me this old, smiling sweetly while I forced down tears with my dessert. And now, years later, she had trained her daughter to carry the baton, to insult me so Diana could sit back and watch without lifting a finger. That's what broke me. Not the insult itself, but the knowledge that Diana was teaching her child to humiliate family, to measure worth by diamonds and handbags, to believe that cruelty was currency. I set my fork down slowly, the clatter making everyone look up again. I could feel the weight of the folder in my bag like a secret ready to detonate. The shares I owned weren't just numbers on paper. They were leverage, power Diana didn't know I had. Her husband had begged me for the money, spinning promises and projections, and I had agreed on one condition, that I be given equal ownership in a crucial branch of his business. He had signed without hesitation, eager for the funds, and I had watched quietly as the company grew, its value multiplying while Diana bragged about vacations she couldn't afford. And now, while she mocked me for being too poor for real jewelry, I sat across the table owning a bigger stake in her lifestyle than she did. The irony was almost unbearable. My pulse thudded in my ears, not from shame, but from anticipation. I knew this dinner was the perfect stage to let it all out, to peel away her mask in front of everyone who had watched her play queen for so long. And the best part? I didn't even need to raise my voice. All it would take was one line, one revelation, one piece of paper laid gently on the table, and her world, the house, the jewelry, the smug superiority would tilt beneath her feet. Diana thought she had embarrassed me tonight, but she had no idea she had just lit the fuse. I folded my napkin slowly, deliberately, letting the quiet action slice through the hum of conversation. My brother glanced at me nervously, as though he sensed something was coming, but he didn't know what. Diana's voice filled the room again, light and sugary, retelling a story about the boutique where she just happened to run into a celebrity, embellishing every detail so she could drop the name of her latest purchase. A diamond necklace she wore now like a medal of superiority. She tilted her chin, letting it sparkle under the chandelier, and her eyes flicked toward me for approval she'd never get. That's when I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, and asked casually, "Diana, does your husband know you've been bragging about jewelry bought with money from a company you don't even control?" The room went silent. Her glass froze halfway to her lips. My brother's eyes widened. My niece blinked, confused, while my father frowned as though he'd misheard. But I didn't stop. 2 years ago, your husband came to me for help. He needed capital. I gave it to him, but not as a loan, as equity. I'm sure he mentioned it in passing. I reached for my bag by the chair and slid the folder onto the table, tapping it once with my finger. So, technically, the company you love to flaunt, the one that pays for those little shopping sprees, I own more of it than he does. Diana's face drained of color, her practiced smile cracking like porcelain under pressure. She tried to laugh, a high, brittle sound, but no one joined her. My brother shifted in his chair, his mouth opening and closing, searching for words he couldn't find. My niece stared at me like I'd just revealed the family had been living inside a movie set. That bracelet, I added, glancing at my wrist, was my grandmother's. It has more real value, more history, than anything you've ever worn. And unlike your diamonds, it doesn't come with debt attached. I leaned back, calm, steady, watching as the silence grew heavier by the second. Diana opened her mouth, then closed it again, her cheeks flaming red. For the first time in years, she had no comeback, no snide remark, no quick jab. And for the first time in years, everyone at the table was looking at her, not with admiration, but with pity. The queen of appearances had been dethroned with a single folder and a single sentence, and she knew it. Diana's hand trembled as she set her glass down, the stem clicking against the table like a warning bell. But she tried to recover, plastering on that wide, brittle smile she always used when she was cornered. "Well," she said with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes, "I'm sure you're exaggerating. My husband handles all the serious business matters." Her voice dripped with condescension, but I could see the panic flickering in her eyes, the way she darted a glance at him as though begging for backup. My brother shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, but he didn't speak. He couldn't, because he knew. I watched him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and for a moment our eyes locked. And in that silence, he confirmed what I already knew. She had no idea. He had never told her. He had let her prance around like the queen of the empire, never once mentioning that part of it didn't even belong to him anymore. I let the silence stretch until Diana's face flushed crimson. Exaggerating? I finally said, my voice low but steady. I don't exaggerate. I document. I flipped open the folder, sliding a notarized contract across the table. The paper landed squarely in front of her untouched plate of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. Her eyes scanned the bold print, the signatures at the bottom, and I watched the color drain from her face as she realized it was real. The room was so quiet I could hear my niece's breath hitch as she leaned forward, confused but sensing something monumental was happening. Diana looked at her husband again, her eyes wide, her smile gone. "Is this—" she began, but her voice broke. He rubbed his forehead with a weary sigh, refusing to meet her gaze. And that was the final blow. She understood then. Her empire wasn't hers. Her status, her superiority, her sparkling diamonds and smug glances, all of it rested on ground that I owned more securely than she ever had. I sat back, calm and collected, while she sat frozen, stripped of the illusion she had built so carefully over the years. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to gloat. The truth sat on the table between us, undeniable, and for the first time in a very long time, Diana was the one who looked small. Diana's fork slipped against her plate, the metal clattering louder than it should have, and she scrambled to pick it up as though the sound hadn't already betrayed her shaking hands. My niece stared at her mother, wide-eyed and confused, but I could see the questions forming behind those young eyes. If Mom was always right, then why did she look so wrong now? Diana tried to steady herself, straightening her back, adjusting her necklace so it caught the light, but the effect was ruined. The sparkle no longer impressed anyone at that table. My father leaned forward, squinting at the document as though he could will the print to explain what years of family dinners never had. "Is this true?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying more weight than a shout ever could. My brother's silence was deafening. He rubbed his palms against his thighs, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test. Finally, he muttered, "Yes, it's true. She owns more than I do." The words fell into the room like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward until everyone sat back in stunned silence. My niece blinked, her lips parting, and for the first time she looked at me not with disdain, but with something close to respect. Or maybe confusion, the kind that comes when the story you've been told no longer matches the truth in front of your eyes. Diana's cheeks flamed, her lips quivering as she tried to summon the sharp tongue that had served her so well for years. But no quip came, no venom-laced remark. Instead, she pressed her napkin to her mouth as though she could hide behind the thin fabric. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. I simply lifted my glass, took a slow sip of water, and let the silence hang until it became unbearable. Because this wasn't just about winning an argument or defending myself from a childish insult. This was about balance. Years of mockery tipped back into truth. Years of humiliation dissolved in a single revelation. And the most satisfying part wasn't her silence, but the knowledge that from this moment forward, every time Diana opened her mouth to mock me, every person at this table would remember tonight. They would remember her face when she realized the woman she belittled for being too poor was the one holding the foundation of her life in her hands. And Diana would never be able to roll her eyes at me again without remembering that truth. The room felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened, and Diana was sinking into it with every passing second. She tried once more to rally, forcing out a laugh that sounded too high, too desperate. "Well, if that's true," she said, her voice trembling, "then I suppose we should thank you for your contribution." The word cracked in her throat like it hurt to say, and I could see her nails digging into the fabric of her napkin as she clenched it in her lap. My brother finally looked at me, his face pale and drawn. But there was something else in his expression now, a kind of relief. As if he was grateful I had taken the burden off his shoulders, even if it came at the expense of Diana's pride. My father leaned back in his chair, studying Diana with the kind of disappointed silence that cuts deeper than anger. My niece shifted uncomfortably, staring at her plate, no longer repeating her mother's venom, but shrinking from it, embarrassed to have carried it. And that was when I realized the shift wasn't just in Diana's humiliation, it was in the room itself. The spell she had cast over this family for years, with her glittering smiles and poisoned whispers, had finally broken. For years she had built her power on silencing me, on making me the scapegoat so she could shine brighter. But now the truth lay in black ink on the table, undeniable, unshakable, and her throne had crumbled beneath her. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to explain myself. I had simply pulled back the curtain, and everyone saw her for what she was. A woman terrified of losing the illusion of control. I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady, my fingers brushing against the bracelet on my wrist. The weight of my grandmother's gift reminded me of where true value lies. Not in borrowed diamonds or credit card statements, but in legacy, in choices, in strength. Diana's face was still flushed, her eyes darting, searching for an escape that didn't exist. And in that moment, I knew this dinner was the last time she would ever dare to make me small again, because she had finally learned that the woman she mocked was the one holding the strings all along. And that knowledge would haunt her far longer than any insult ever haunted me. Diana's hands shook as she pushed the contract aside, her lips pressed into a thin line that could no longer fake a smile. I watched her struggle, her eyes darting toward my brother for rescue, but he sat slumped in his chair, defeated, the weight of years of silence finally crashing down on him. My father broke the quiet with a sigh, the kind that carried decades of disappointment. "All these years," he said softly, "you mocked her, made her feel less, when all along she was the one holding the ground beneath your feet." His words cut sharper than mine ever could, and I saw Diana flinch as if struck. My niece's face was pale, her wide eyes fixed on me as though she'd just realized the stories her mother fed her were lies. She picked nervously at the beads on her bracelet, too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel the shame soaking the table. Diana tried to regain her composure, tossing her hair back, reaching for her wine again, but her hand trembled so much that the liquid sloshed against the rim. "So what?" she finally snapped, the venom returning in desperation. "You think owning a piece of paper makes you better than me? You'll never have what I have." Her voice cracked, betraying the fear behind her words. I didn't rise to the bait. I simply folded the folder closed, slid it neatly back into my bag, and looked her in the eye. "No, Diana," I said calmly. "I'll never have what you have. Because I don't need to buy my worth with debt. I don't need to tear people down to feel tall. And I don't need a necklace to remind me who I am." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. My brother rubbed his temples, the reality of his wife's unraveling pride sinking in, while my father shook his head slowly, his gaze full of quiet judgment. For the first time, the balance of power at that table shifted fully, irreversibly. Everyone had seen the truth, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. I didn't gloat, I didn't celebrate, because I didn't need to. My revenge wasn't about shouting or victory laps. It was about the quiet satisfaction of watching her own arrogance strip her bare. And as Diana sat there, her jewels heavy on her neck, her cheeks flushed with humiliation, I knew this dinner would be etched in her memory forever. The night her mask slipped, the night the family stopped seeing her as the flawless queen and started seeing her for what she was, a woman desperate to hide her cracks. I gathered my things slowly when dinner finally ended, the scrape of my chair against the hardwood sounding louder than it should, but no one said a word to fill the silence. My niece avoided my eyes, her face still flushed from repeating words she didn't fully understand, and for a moment I felt a pang of sympathy for her. She hadn't known she was being used as her mother's weapon. My brother stood awkwardly, hands shoved into his pockets, unable to look at either of us. And Diana, she remained frozen in her seat, her diamond necklace glinting like a chain she couldn't take off, her mouth tight as though any movement might shatter what little composure she had left. I slipped the folder back into my bag and walked toward the door, pausing long enough to rest my hand against the frame and glance back one last time. "I don't need anyone's approval here," I said softly but firmly. "Not anymore." My father gave a small nod, his eyes warm with something I hadn't seen in years. Pride. My niece's lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but she stayed quiet. Diana stared down at her plate, unable to meet my gaze, her empire of appearances crumbling right there under the weight of her silence. When I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like freedom. The stars hung high above the darkened street, and for the first time in years, I breathed without feeling like I was shrinking in someone else's shadow. My heels clicked against the pavement as I walked to my car, each step steady, certain. I didn't need revenge in the form of screaming or gloating. The quiet truth had been louder than anything I could have said. My grandmother's bracelet glimmered softly on my wrist under the streetlights. A reminder of where my strength really came from. not from wealth flaunted at a table, but from choices made with integrity, discipline, and patience. I started the engine, my reflection catching in the rearview mirror, and I realized I no longer looked like the woman Diana had mocked for years. I looked like someone free, someone untouchable, someone who had finally taken back her power. And as I drove away from that house, the house where I had endured so many small humiliations, I felt the corners of my mouth curve into a calm, knowing smile. Because I hadn't just ended Diana's reign of cruelty, I had ended my silence, and that was the sweetest victory of all. Tell me, ladies, if you were in my place, would you have exposed her at the table or walked away without a word?